It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and the first-class lounge at Gate 17 was filled with the usual crowd: high-powered executives, influencers angling for Instagram moments, and trust fund kids treating a flight to Tokyo like it was a party invitation. Everyone was dressed to be seen. Tailored suits, designer luggage, watches worth more than some cars. Amid all that polished excess stood a man who seemed like he'd wandered in by accident. Keanu Reeves. He wore a soft, worn-out leather jacket, the kind that looked more sentimental than expensive. His black boots were well-loved, his jeans had small tears along the knees, and instead of some expensive briefcase, he carried a weathered canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Most people didn't recognize him right away. Out of context, without the Hollywood spotlight, he could have been anyone: a writer, musician, maybe a guy who worked construction and saved up for this one special trip. But that didn't stop the stares. The man who noticed first was Blake Renshaw. 2 rows behind Keanu stood Blake Renshaw, a man who didn't just see first class as a luxury, he saw it as his birthright. If arrogance could wear cologne, it would smell exactly like Blake, a custom blend of aged leather, overpriced whiskey, and desperation to impress. His navy power suit was sharper than a lawsuit, his hair slicked back so tightly it might have been classified as industrial-grade adhesive, and his $5,000 loafers looked like they'd file a restraining order if they ever touched public pavement. But Blake didn't roll alone. Hovering just off his right shoulder was Connor Tate, his business partner, occasional yes-man, and full-time hype squad. Connor was smaller, paler, and infinitely more eager, the kind of guy whose laugh was always a beat too loud and whose jokes never quite landed. Where Blake was confident, Connor was frantic, constantly checking his smartwatch, snapping gum, and tapping through emails like the fate of the global economy depended on his inbox. Wherever Blake postured, Connor nodded. Wherever Blake sneered, Connor giggled. Together, they were a 2-man wrecking crew of self-importance, leaving trails of entitlement wherever they went. When Blake spotted Keanu Reeves standing calmly in the first-class line, it was like someone had spray-painted graffiti on a yacht. The worn leather jacket. The scuffed boots. The weathered canvas duffel bag that probably cost less than Blake's cufflinks. It offended everything Blake believed first class should be. Blake's eyebrows shot up so high they almost qualified for frequent flyer miles. "Lost, buddy?" Blake called out, making sure his voice had just the right mix of sarcasm and volume to pull in an audience. Keanu, serene as ever, gave a slight smile, turned a page in his dog-eared paperback, and didn't bother replying. Connor, always eager to join the act, leaned toward Blake, whispering a little too loudly. Maybe they started letting influencers in just for content. You know, like a social experiment or something. Blake snorted, loud enough to turn even more heads. Hope they don't run out of champagne. This ain't Coach, pal. Keanu, still unbothered, turned another page, like the whole exchange wasn't even worth his time. And that silence? It was the ultimate insult. Blake's smirk thinned into a clenched jaw, his ego already itching for a fight. Connor, sensing the mood shift, chuckled nervously, trying to keep up. Bet he's here on points. Probably flew Coach his whole life and saved up for one bucket list trip. Blake grinned, feeding off Connor's energy. Well, we'll make sure he remembers it. As the line inched forward, Keanu, still calm, still silent, had no idea he'd just become Blake and Connor's personal entertainment for the next 11 hours. Or so they thought. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, and the slow-moving line of first-class passengers trickled down the jet bridge. Blake led the charge, phone in one hand, carry-on in the other, talking way too loudly about his latest investment win, to absolutely no one in particular. Behind him, Connor trailed like an obedient golden retriever in designer sneakers, juggling his laptop bag, blazer, and the weight of his own insecurity. As they stepped onto the plane, Blake's eyes scanned the first-class cabin like a general surveying the battlefield. "Suite 3A, he muttered. "Best seat on the plane." Connor fumbled with his boarding pass. I'm right behind you. Blake smirked. Close enough. You can still hear me give investment tips. Connor laughed, a little too hard, as if Blake had just cracked a late-night comedy special. But as Blake stepped toward his prized seat, his grin faltered. Because sitting in 3B, right beside Blake's carefully selected throne, was none other than the man with the leather jacket and the beat-up duffel bag, Keanu Reeves. Blake's face did a double-take so hard it could have qualified as a neck injury. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, eyes flicking to Connor for some kind of cosmic reassurance. Connor squinted, recognizing Keanu instantly, though not from admiration. "Wait, that guy?" Connor whispered. "He's sitting next to you." Blake's nostrils flared like a racehorse at the starting gate. "What is this? A reality show prank?" Keanu, already comfortably settled in, looked up just long enough to offer that same peaceful, polite smile. "Looks like we're neighbors," Keanu said softly, his tone warm enough to be friendly, but not apologetic. Blake slid into his seat with the grace of a man accepting a court summons. He slammed his carry-on into the overhead bin, letting it rattle loudly, hoping to make some sort of passive-aggressive point, though even he wasn't sure what that point was. As Blake sat down, Connor leaned over the back of Blake's seat, stage whispering loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Dude, this is why they should screen people before they let them into first class. There should be, like, an income test." Keanu just reached into his duffel and pulled out his book again, completely unfazed. His fingers rested lightly on the well-worn pages, the cover barely holding together from years of use. Blake couldn't leave it alone. "You know," Blake said, loud enough to attract the attention of the couple across the aisle, "first class used to be for a certain type of traveler." Keanu kept his eyes on his book. "Oh," he said, his voice low, calm. "What type is that?" Blake grinned like a cat with a trapped mouse. "People who actually belong here." Connor snorted so hard he nearly knocked over his water bottle. Keanu turned a page, his expression unchanged. "Guess we'll see," he said softly. The flight attendant came by, her smile trained to perfection, and asked if they'd like pre-departure drinks. Blake, still performing for the cabin, waved dramatically. "Champagne. Something good." Connor, desperate to keep up, fumbled his request. Yeah. Same for me. Champagne. Whatever's fancy." When the attendant turned to Keanu, he glanced up and offered a gentle shake of his head. "Just water, thanks." Blake couldn't resist. "Water? In first class?" He leaned toward Connor, voice loud enough for everyone nearby. "What do you think, Con? Evian or puddle runoff?" Connor burst into nervous laughter, though his eyes darted around to see if anyone else was laughing. They weren't. Keanu? Still calm. Still polite. "Water's all I need." And with that, he went right back to his book, leaving Blake and Connor stuck performing for an audience that didn't care. Blake leaned back in his seat, fingers drumming against his armrest. Something about Keanu's lack of reaction was driving him insane. He lived for status games, for one-upmanship, for being the center of attention. But Keanu wasn't playing. And without someone to dominate, Blake was stuck stewing in his own insecurity. Connor, sensing the weird shift in energy, tried to fill the silence. "Hey, so what do you do? Work in, like, tech or something?" he asked Keanu, desperate to figure out why someone dressed like a weekend biker had a seat that usually belonged to hedge fund managers and movie producers. Keanu glanced up, friendly as ever. "I work in film." Connor's brow furrowed, not quite putting the pieces together. "Oh, like, corporate videos? Marketing?" Keanu just smiled. "Something like that." Blake's frustration was palpable. This wasn't how the flight was supposed to go. He wasn't just sitting next to someone he couldn't read, he was sitting next to someone he couldn't intimidate. And for Blake, that was unacceptable. As the cabin crew finished their pre-flight checks, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We're expecting some moderate turbulence after takeoff, so please keep your seatbelts fastened." Blake muttered, "Perfect." But he had no idea that the real turbulence wasn't coming from the weather. It was coming from the calmest man in first class, the man whose identity would flip Blake's entire world upside down. The engines roared to life as the plane began taxiing, the familiar hum filling the cabin. Out the window, the rain streaked across the glass, a steady reminder that no matter how wealthy or important you thought you were, some things were beyond your control. Blake, still brooding over the unexpected presence of leather jacket guy next to him, busied himself by making a show of adjusting his seat controls, sighing loudly every time the lumbar support moved a fraction of an inch. Connor, ever the loyal sidekick, leaned forward from his seat behind Blake. "Bet he's one of those guys who bought a ticket with points and maxed out some cashback card," Connor whispered, loud enough to ensure Keanu could hear. Blake snorted. "Or some Hollywood reject who thinks first class is a personality." Keanu, who hadn't even looked up from his book, quietly reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small notebook, leather cover worn smooth from years of use. He jotted something down, maybe a note, maybe a thought, but the act of writing in silence felt like a small declaration of peace. That small gesture, choosing to write instead of react, irked Blake even more. The plane climbed steadily, piercing through a thick layer of clouds. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, and with it, Blake's self-control. The first-class flight attendant, a woman named Marla, made her way through the cabin offering welcome drinks. She was professional, but her trained smile faltered for just a second when she saw Blake. He was the type she'd served before, the guy who ordered based on price, not preference. "Champagne," Blake said, barely glancing at her. "Your best bottle. None of that house stuff." Marla smiled politely. "Of course, sir." Connor, eager to keep up, mimicked Blake. "Same for me, but, you know, 2 glasses." When Marla turned to Keanu, he shook his head gently. "Just water, please." Blake let out an exaggerated laugh, loud enough to draw attention. "Water? In first class? What's the point of flying up here if you're just gonna slum it?" Connor laughed, though it came out more like a hiccup, clearly unsure whether Blake was joking or serious. Keanu's response was simple, quiet enough to make everyone lean in to hear it. "Comfort doesn't come from the glass." Blake's grin faltered for half a second, but his ego wouldn't let him lose face. "Deep. Real deep. Did you pull that from a fortune cookie?" Connor laughed, not because it was funny, but because that's what he did. Keanu didn't flinch. He just turned the page of his book, as calm as ever. Right on cue, the plane hit its first patch of turbulence, a short, sharp dip that sent silverware clattering. Blake's champagne sloshed out of his glass, landing squarely on his silk tie. "Are you kidding me?" Blake barked, glaring at Marla like she'd personally triggered the turbulence. Marla, to her credit, handled it with grace. "Would you like a towel, sir?" Before she could grab one, Keanu quietly reached into his bag, pulled out a clean handkerchief, and held it out to Blake. For a moment, Blake just stared at it, confused, almost offended by the gesture. But the turbulence jostled the cabin again, and with no better options, Blake snatched the handkerchief out of Keanu's hand. He muttered something that might have been, "thanks," but it was swallowed by his grumbling about the cheap plane and idiot pilots. Just as the turbulence subsided, the curtain separating first class from the galley opened. A man stepped out, but not just any man. It was the airline's regional director for North America, Michael Garrison, flying discreetly in 1A. Most passengers wouldn't recognize him, but Blake did, because Michael was the type of person who could make or break deals on luxury partnerships. "Mr. Garrison," Blake said instantly, standing halfway like a desperate kid trying to impress a teacher. Michael gave a polite nod, but his eyes flicked briefly to Keanu, and something shifted in his expression: recognition, admiration, even a hint of respect. "Good to see you again, Mr. Reeves," Michael said, offering a slight bow of his head. Blake's brain short-circuited. "Reeves?" Blake blurted, a full second behind reality. "Like Keanu Reeves?" Connor's mouth actually fell open, his gum nearly tumbling onto his lap. Keanu gave a small, polite nod. "Nice to see you again, Michael," he said softly, like they were old acquaintances catching up. Blake's entire sense of reality wobbled like the plane itself. "This guy?" Blake gestured wildly at Keanu's boots, his jacket, the duffel bag that looked like it belonged in a lost-and-found bin. "This guy is Keanu Reeves?" Michael's smile was gentle, but there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Renshaw. And we're very honored to have him flying with us today." Blake collapsed back into his seat like someone had unplugged his spine. Connor's face was stuck in a frozen half-smile, half-grimace, the look of a man who knew he'd backed the wrong horse. Keanu just took a sip of his water, completely unfazed. Word spread faster than free champagne at a wedding. Passengers whispered, heads craned, and phones appeared discreetly, cameras snapping blurry photos of the legend sitting quietly in seat 3B. Blake, who'd spent the whole flight performing for an imaginary audience, suddenly realized there was a real audience now, and none of them were on his side. For the first time all day, he was speechless. Blake slouched lower in his seat, the weight of his own arrogance sinking onto him like a collapsing skyscraper. Connor looked like he wanted to crawl into the overhead bin. But the flight wasn't over, and neither was Keanu's quiet lesson in grace. What came next wouldn't just haunt Blake for the flight, it would follow him long after the wheels touched down. Blake sat slumped in his first-class throne, the handkerchief still clutched in his fist, his silk tie permanently stained by champagne and his own inflated ego. His mind spun in circles, trying to process what just happened. Keanu Reeves, the Keanu Reeves, had been sitting next to him this entire time. Connor, pale as skim milk, sat hunched behind Blake, practically sinking into his seat. Every time Connor tried to whisper something to salvage the situation, his words caught in his throat, and all that came out was an awkward, high-pitched wheeze. Meanwhile, Keanu sat serene and unbothered, quietly flipping pages in his battered paperback like none of this was even happening. But the rest of the cabin? They were paying attention now. The ripple effect spread row by row. First-class passengers, who had been quietly observing Blake and Connor's peacocking since boarding, now leaned toward each other in hushed whispers. "Wait, is that really him? John Wick himself? My brother said Keanu's the nicest guy in Hollywood." A woman across the aisle discreetly Googled Keanu Reeves 2025 look, comparing her screen to the man sitting quietly with his book, and then mouthed, "Oh my God," to her husband. Even the flight attendants, pros at keeping their composure, now smiled a little warmer every time they passed Keanu's seat, while barely making eye contact with Blake and Connor. Connor, still a loyal follower at heart, kept hoping Blake would recover, maybe charm his way out of this, throw in a self-deprecating joke, something. But Blake? Blake had gone full malfunction. He shifted, fidgeted, stared straight ahead, sweat forming along his hairline. Every glance toward Keanu felt like staring into the sun of his own bad decisions. Connor leaned forward, trying one last time to salvage the day. "So, Mr. Reeves," he stammered, forcing a thin smile, "you do a lot of traveling?" Keanu turned, polite as ever. "From time to time," he said softly. Connor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had nothing. That's when it happened, something Blake never expected. The man sitting directly across the aisle, a gray-haired gentleman in a simple sweater and worn loafers, leaned over. "Excuse me," the man said softly to Keanu, "I just wanted to say, your films meant a lot to my son when he was going through chemo." Blake's eyes widened. Keanu set his book down and gave the man his full attention. "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice genuine and warm. "That means more to me than you know." The older man's eyes glistened. "No, thank you." Passengers nearby were now fully tuned in, some were even pretending to read while quietly watching Keanu, not Blake, become the true center of first class. Blake, unable to stand the shift in attention, blurted out a clumsy laugh. "Funny thing, right?" he said, trying to elbow his way into the moment. "You never know who you'll run into up here." No one laughed. No one even responded. The silence was louder than any turbulence. Keanu, ever polite, turned to Blake for the first time since the big reveal. "You know," Keanu said quietly, "first class isn't really about the seat." Blake blinked. "Wha? It's about how you make people feel," Keanu continued, voice soft but firm. "Up here, down there, doesn't really matter. Respect doesn't have a seating chart." Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. For once, there was nothing to buy, nothing to flex, nothing to control. Keanu had just dismantled his entire worldview, with a smile. As the plane settled into smoother air, a passenger 2 rows back started clapping, soft at first, like an instinct. Another joined in. Then another. Before long, half the first-class cabin was applauding. They weren't just applauding Keanu, they were applauding the takedown, the humility, and the reminder that no amount of money could buy what Keanu had. Blake's face turned so red it could have powered the cabin lights. Connor, desperate to escape the attention vortex, faked a yawn so exaggerated it could have won an Oscar for overacting. "Well, I guess it's time to get some sleep, right, Blake?" he mumbled. Blake didn't answer. He just stared at his champagne glass, swirling the remnants like they might offer answers. But there were no answers at the bottom of that glass, only the reflection of a man who had just been served a masterclass in humility by the calmest man in the room. The seatbelt sign lit up again, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we'll begin our descent into Tokyo shortly." But for Blake? The descent had already started. Because once they landed, there'd be nowhere to hide. The seatbelt sign glowed as the plane began its gentle descent into Tokyo Narita Airport. The hum of the engine softened, but the tension hanging over Blake and Connor felt heavier than ever. Blake hadn't said a word in over an hour. Connor? He'd given up trying to salvage the situation. All he could do was sit quietly, replaying every arrogant joke, every snide comment, every smug laugh, now painfully aware that they'd all been directed at Keanu Reeves. The guy who, without saying much at all, had completely stripped their egos down to nothing. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the usual first-class rush began, passengers unbuckling, stretching, preparing to be the first off the plane. Keanu, however, didn't move. He sat calmly, allowing the older passengers to step out first. When he did stand, there was no fanfare, no hurry, just quiet grace. Blake, still planted in his seat, could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin glancing his way, silently passing judgment. He could almost hear the viral video captions writing themselves. "Finance bro humiliated after mocking Keanu Reeves on a flight." Connor, his face a shade paler than usual, muttered, You okay, man?" Blake didn't answer. He just wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and stood up, realizing for the first time in years how small he actually felt. At the front of the cabin, Keanu paused, duffel slung over his shoulder. A young flight attendant, her eyes wide with admiration, softly said, "Mr. Reeves, it's been an honor having you on board." Keanu gave her a smile so genuine it could have melted the fuselage. "Thanks for taking care of us." The "us" made her smile even brighter. Blake, standing a few feet back, felt like a ghost at his own funeral. He knew he should say something, an apology, a joke, anything to erase the last 11 hours of arrogance and ignorance. But all that came out was, have a good trip. Keanu turned back, smile intact. You too. Simple. Unbothered. Effortlessly kind. And with that, Keanu stepped off the plane, leaving behind only the echo of everything he stood for. The terminal was buzzing. News had already spread through the airport. Keanu Reeves had been on that flight. Staff from neighboring gates lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse. Blake and Connor followed, their usual VIP swagger replaced by something closer to defeat. As they approached customs, a teenage girl wearing a John Wick hoodie spotted Keanu standing off to the side, waiting for his duffel to come off the oversized luggage cart. She hesitated at first, then approached, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Reeves?" she asked softly. "I'm sorry, I don't want to bother you, but could I maybe get a picture?" Keanu knelt down slightly to her height, making her feel at ease. "Of course," he said, as though he had all the time in the world. Blake and Connor watched from a distance. Connor whispered, "Can you imagine anyone asking us for a picture?" Blake didn't answer. He knew the answer was no. As Keanu posed for the photo, making sure the girl's dad got a second one, just in case, something clicked inside Blake's mind. This man had more fame, money, and influence than Blake could dream of. But Keanu didn't wield it like a weapon. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't use it to make anyone feel small. Instead, he used it to make people feel seen. For the first time in a long time, Blake wondered. What would it feel like to be that kind of person? Blake could have slipped past Keanu in the terminal. He could have left the whole experience behind like an inconvenient memory. But instead, he stopped. "Hey. Keanu," Blake said awkwardly, his voice quieter than anyone expected. Keanu turned, relaxed as always. "Yeah?" Blake swallowed hard. "About earlier. Keanu raised a hand, stopping him gently. "It's all right." "No," Blake said quickly. "It's not." He glanced at Connor, who was shrinking into the background, and then back at Keanu. "I was a jackass," Blake admitted. "I don't know what I thought. But I'm sorry." Keanu held his gaze for a moment, the kind of moment that stretches just long enough to matter. "Thanks for saying that," Keanu said softly. "But don't just say it to me." Blake frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Keanu's smile returned. "Say it to the next person you think doesn't belong." Blake's throat tightened slightly. "Yeah. Okay." And with that, Keanu disappeared into the crowd, blending in so effortlessly you'd never guess he was one of the most beloved men on the planet. As Blake and Connor stood at the customs line, the weight of what had happened finally settled in Blake's chest. For years, Blake had believed power meant making people feel small. But now, he realized the strongest person in any room was the one who made others feel valued. He wasn't sure if he could be that person. But for the first time, he wanted to try. Moral of the story. True class isn't about the seat you sit in, it's about the way you treat the people sitting beside you. And sometimes, the people we judge the harshest are the ones who can teach us the most, if we're willing to listen.